Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Crimson Chronicles Podcast. We are now at episode 8. Can you believe it? We're just having a great time as we walk back through Crimson Tide history and look at some special time and special people in the life of Crimson Tide athletics. Today, we have a guest with us that is going to be well known to Crimson Tide fans and somebody that we're going to be able to have some great faith conversations with as well. And Tommy, why don't you help us get acquainted today with Keith Pugh?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you, Rick. My friend Keith Pugh is with us today. Keith is one of those late 70s national championship guys who writ his name in Crimson Flame for his prowess on the field in the Wishbone offense as a receiver. He and Ozzie Newsome were right neck and neck in all the statistics. Keith is from Evergreen, Alabama. At Monroe Academy, I've read that you played flanker, halfback, quarterback, and safety, all state honors for 3 years, won your state championship. But then this is what was amazing. You earned 3 letters in football, 3 in basketball, 2 in baseball, 4 in track. And then as a junior in one game, you rushed for 255 yards on 21 carries. And then when you went to Alabama, you're on the freshman team. Back then, it was just the freshman squad. And you played quarterback, halfback, safety, and handled the punting duties. You averaged 39 yards a punt in the 76 8A game and a game high 12 tackles. Man, you are the ultimate Swiss Army knife of Alabama Crimson Tide history.
The old saying, jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah.
We were at a small private school and enjoyed playing there. We had a great coach champion. We won a lot of ball games. But when I got to Alabama, they originally said I would be a defensive back, and that was fine. But that freshman year, I did play some running back, a little quarterback, but punted. And I just wanted to be on the field, and I wanted to play for Alabama. That was my goal.
So were you an Alabama fan growing up?
My dad was really a Coach Bryant fan, like a lot of people. And so we pulled for Alabama.
Right.
Had good friends, Evergreen, kind of Connecticut County, a lot of Auburn people there. And it was one or the other. And no one in our family had been to the university, but we picked Alabama primarily because of Coach Bryant. I remember sitting in the kitchen listening on the radio when Alabama played Southern Cal out in Los Angeles in 71. And just loved Alabama, loved Coach Bryant. And that was really a dream come true to get to go to Alabama.
When's the first time you heard from Alabama football
or Coach Bryant? I was fortunate enough to play on a high school team that KJ Lazenby played at Alabama. And he was a senior when I was a sophomore in high school. And so as they recruited KJ, I guess they saw me playing. And so there was a little bit of a connection there. And then my senior year in 74, I was recruited by Hayden Riley, who had coached basketball and baseball at Alabama and did some recruiting for Coach Bryant. And so he told me we had set up a trip to come to Tuscaloosa. And he said, now, Keith, Coach Bryant's going to call you sometime this week. And you can imagine a little kid in Evergreen, Alabama, waiting on a phone call from Coach Bryant. And I can't remember what night it was, but I remember I was excited. And it was really interesting because he was probably had a whole list of guys to call, but just wanted to touch base with you. And he ended the conversation. He said, now, Keith, we want you up here next year wearing that red jersey. And I was trying to be, I guess, maybe cool or whatever. I said, Coach, I'm thinking about it. And he said, thinking about it, I want you. So I said, okay, Coach, I'll come. Now, I recruited on the phone. I committed on the phone. No press conference, no hats or anything. I told him I'd come. I really didn't know that he wanted me, to be honest with you. But when he said, we want you wearing your red jersey, that was big.
Can you imagine in Evergreen, Alabama, waiting for Coach Bryant to call? Only probably one phone in the house. There's no caller ID or anything. There may be even a party line in Evergreen, Alabama.
I have a sister who's 2 years younger than me, and she had a habit of being on the phone. And so I was trying to keep, but I do remember those party line days as well.
We're going to have to explain that to some kids that are listening to the podcast, right? They have no idea at this point what we're talking about. Keith, you then came in class of 75, and man, you were a part of quite a recruiting class to the University of Alabama. Who were some of the folks came in with?
The headliners were Jeff Rutledge and Tony Nathan. They both Yeah,
Right.
it's interesting. It would have been great to see recruiting classes, how they would score those, because those guys were 5 stars. And of course, we had the younger David Hanna, the younger Hanna brother, and with some guys who turned out to be great players, Steve Whitman, Buddy Idolette, Vince Booth, the great guys there, Wayne Hamilton. Wayne was a year behind us, but there was Murray Legg was a great player. And I was part of the group, as Coach Bryant would say. He said we had a lot of football players who weren't great football players, but they thought they were. And so I was one of those guys that just wanted to be there. And we had, but Nathan and Jeff Rutledge would have been Kelvin Croom. Kelvin was a tremendous athlete.
Yeah.
He tore his knee up his freshman year. He was a 5-star. You remember how he was playing with the varsity that first year until it hurt.
Wow. Barry Krause, Marty Lyons, those guys were part of your class.
Barry Krause, Marty Lyons, big name athletes, had great pro careers, and a really good player.
You look back at that class, and you mentioned the idea that the way classes are ranked today and the way that recruiting services look at classes, that has to be one of the all-time greatest classes to ever come to Tuscaloosa in a single year.
I would think so, just based on the success of the team and, again, pro careers with Jeff and Tony and Marty and Barry. Of course, Dwight Stevenson ended up graduating with us, but a lot of us were redshirted. Coach Bryant would redshirt a lot of players in those days. For the 79 team, we were all seniors together. Dwight Stevenson was a part of our graduating class. Pretty good guy.
It's amazing.
Keith, that first year, I called you the Swiss Army knife in terms of your positions. But what did you want to play? And did you play defensive back for a while? Tell me about the change to offense.
We played 3 games my freshman year. We played Georgia Tech, Ole Miss, and Auburn. And as you mentioned, I punted. We beat Georgia Tech. To tell you, it was a thrilling game. We beat them 3-2, and I scored the 2 points. I scored the 2 points for Georgia Tech. We were backed up, and we worked on every day a slow safety and a quick safety. Quick safety, they just snapped the ball over my head. So slow safety, they snapped the ball to the punter, and I'd run around the end zone and step out of bounds, and that's what we did. And so we were up 3-0 late in the game, backed up. And anyway, we gave them 2 points. But I played defensive back. I did play running back against Ole Miss over in Oxford, and we won that game. Played defensive back again against Auburn. But the next year I was redshirted. We were getting ready to play UCLA in the Liberty Bowl in 76. And I was on the scout team as a defensive back. And some of the receivers on the scout team got hurt or something was going on. So they had to put me in action on the scout team playing wide receiver. And so I made some catches and did some things. And Bobby Marks, who was a receiver coach, he asked me, he said, would you like to play wide receiver? Coach, I'd love to. And this is funny. He said, I'll talk to Coach Bryant. And so this was in the end of the off season, that bowl game in the off season. So at workouts, I'd see Coach Marks and say, have you talked to Coach Bryant? No, not yet. Have you talked to Coach Bryant? No, not yet. Finally, about 2 weeks later, he said, why don't you talk to Coach Bryant? I got the impression that even the coaches weren't excited about just dropping one to keep it from. So I made an appointment, and he'd always said, I'll never keep you waiting over 3 minutes. And so I made an appointment, and I went in, sat in the couch and sank down. And I said, Coach Marks thinks it'd be a good idea for me to play offense. And he looked at me and he said, I make all the decisions around here. I said, yes, sir. I think, he really put me off. And I said, yes, sir. Through that conversation, he said, defense is our priority. You'll play defense some this spring, but we'll try you at wide receiver and see how that goes. By the end of the spring, I was playing wide out behind Ozzie. And the next fall, 77, I was backup wide receiver and played, wide receiver the rest of the way. But it started because of preparation for UCLA and the Liberty Bowl and getting to play on the scout team offense.
Now, did you go to that game?
My brother and I went over one of the coldest nights I've ever spent in my life. Freezing. But anyway, I didn't play, didn't dress at all that 76. It was 3 years before I put on a uniform. 75 was with the JV team. 76 redshirted, and then 77 we opened with Ole Miss, and that was my first game.
Can you imagine nowadays for a kid to have the patience to sit for 2 years before you have the opportunity to be able to see any game action at all?
Of course, with everything the kids struggle with today and have to deal with, that would never fly. You're going to get to play in 3 years. They want to play first day on campus, and guys are good enough, man. I'll tell you what, that Ryan Williams, those guys, they can't come on campus ready. But we had some guys ready to play. Jeff and Tony, they played as freshmen, and like I said, Kelvin Crew was ready to play. But not everybody develops at the same rate.
Keith, one of the things that I've heard you talk about in other places is, in addition to the development on the field, were some of the things that the Lord did in your life, particularly in your freshman year. Robert Fraley, who many folks will know not as an Alabama backup quarterback, but as Payne Stewart's agent. You were a part of a Bible study with Robert Fraley that made a huge impact on your life. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about that story and what the Lord did during that freshman year?
It was really life-changing, obviously. I roomed with Jeff Rutledge, and Jeff had told Coach Eric White that he wanted a Christian roommate, and I was a good boy from Evergreen, Alabama, had gone to church all my life and could do all this, say all the right things, but I was lost. I really didn't know that until I was rooming with Jeff, and we were invited to this Bible study, and there were KJ Lazenby, Woody Buchanan, Pete Gavin, several guys, Sid Smith. We all sat. Robert was leading us, and one of the things we were doing was memorizing scripture. And it was a part of the Navigator ministry, which is a wonderful scripture memory ministry. And so our assignment for the next week after we met the first time was to memorize 2 Corinthians 5:17. So I remember sitting in Bryant Hall, getting ready for the Bible study the next morning, going over that verse. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things become new. And as I was memorizing that verse, the Holy Spirit just convicted me. I'd been around Christ, but I was not in Christ. And that night in my dorm room, I said, Lord, I want you to come into my life. I want to have a relationship with you. And I had always tried to be a good guy, but never had that peace relationship with Jesus. And so that night in Bryant Hall, room 301, I asked the Lord to come into my heart, and I'll trust in him. Tired of trying to be good enough to earn your favor. I just want to trust in Jesus as my Savior. And so Robert, leading that group, I don't remember ever telling him how much an impact he had on my life, but he really did. And just to know that he's with the Lord now, but what a great guy.
Keith, I'm reminded too, as I think about having heard you tell that story at a little more length, and that the impact of Robert on your life and inviting you to that Bible study and really pointing you to the gospel. There's a whole succession of guys that would be known by folks that are Alabama fans who were won to the Lord as a result of that conversation that extends all the way down to Dabo Swinney. And I think it reminds me of the story of D.L. Moody and Billy Graham and that lineage of succession of people that were faithful to tell the gospel. That's a pretty neat chain of guys that invested in one another to lead across the generations of the Crimson Tide.
I led a Bible study in my dorm room with the freshmen who would come in, and one of the guys who came to Christ, Mike McQueen, was one, but Daryl White came to know the Lord through that study. And then a couple of years later, Daryl is on a road trip, and he's rooming with Joey Jones, and Joey comes to know Christ. Daryl leads Joey to Christ. Yeah. And then Joey was speaking several years later at Pelham High School, and that's when Dabo gave his heart to Christ. I love to tell people Dabo is my great-grandson, but my grandson, who's a senior now, is a big Clemson fan. And so I took him up one spring to see Clemson practice, and Dabo had us in his office, and such a great guy. I love him to death. Had a great connection.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And Keith, the seeds that you planted with those guys, how many people has Dabo affected in all of his years at Clemson? He's been at Clemson for 20-something years now. And just think of all the people that Dabo has led to Christ through his unashamed announcements of the gospel everywhere.
Never compromise. And Joey Jones, Joey is just, Joey loves the Lord. Daryl White, Daryl started the Banks Academy and just touching lives in Birmingham and making a real difference. And that's the power of the gospel. Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel.
Yeah.
It's the power of God for salvation.
Yeah.
And it changes lives. And it's a privilege to be a part of that powerful process.
Back to football, and we'll touch more on your faith in a little while, but give us a brief rundown of your 3 years at UA, 1977, 78, and 79. As you'll remember, 77 season, I was sports editor of the Crimson White, and that's when I first really got to know you and Stedman and Jeff Rutledge and Buddy Adelet, several of those guys. But everybody says the 77 team was probably the most talented of those three, 78 and 79.
Sure.
So
those 3 years, we ended up being 34-2 and won the SEC 3 years in a row, never lost a conference game, won 2 national championships.
Wow.
And the 77 team finished number 2, and 78 and 79 finished number 1. So the 77 team was the one that had Ozzie Newsome, Johnny Davis, Bob Crider, some really strong guys that played in the NFL. We lost early in the season to Nebraska up there in Lincoln. People talk about LSU and how loud Tiger Stadium is. It doesn't hold a candle to Lincoln, Nebraska. You could not hear the guy next to you. Everybody wears red. It was the loudest place I'd ever been. But we lost, and then we came back, won the rest of the games, won the conference, played Ohio State, beat them 35-6. We were number 3 going into the bowl game. Arkansas was 2, and Oklahoma was 2, and Texas was 1. They both lost. Arkansas beat Oklahoma. Notre Dame beat Texas. And that's the year Notre Dame goes from 5th place to 1st place. Truly the luck of the Irish. But we felt good about it. We beat Ohio State, who was a good team. Woody Hayes beat them bad. And then we're shocked that Monday. It seemed so archaic how the polls would work, but we ended up number 2 that year. By the end of the year, it was as good. The 79 team had the best defense I think I'd ever been around. That team got stronger as the year went on. 78 was the year we played Penn State in the Sugar Bowl, the goal line stand. With that team, we lost to Southern Cal in Birmingham, but I watched that game not long ago, just looking at it. And our defense was a different defense by the time we got to Penn State. We had players who were hurt, players that were banged up for whatever reason, but that team was another one that got better each week. We ended up splitting the championship with Southern Cal in 78. But in 79, we were undefeated, winning in both bowls. And that was my senior year. Dwight Stevenson, Jim Bunch, Buddy Adelet, Vince Booth, Tim Travis was our tight end. Had a great defense. Wayne Hamilton, David Hanna was playing tackle, Curtis McGriff, Robbie Jones, Randy Scott played a lot. Really good play.
Yeah. We'll get into some Coach Bryant stories in a minute, but I'll tell you my experience in that 77 season, your first year lettering. I had been selected as sports editor of the Crimson White in April of 77. And I went to Coach Bryant and looking ahead at the schedule and saw where we were playing Nebraska in Lincoln and Southern Cal in Los Angeles in the 77 season. I put on this big sob story about that the Crimson White could not afford to send me to these road games, and I felt like the students should be well represented by the sports editor of the Crimson White going to these trips. And I just flat out asked him if I could go with the team to these road game trips. So he said, let me think about it over the summer. He said, get back with me on picture day. Picture day is the day you gather in mid-August and have your pictures made and do all those weird positions and you're flying through the air and the ball and all that stuff. So I get to picture day and Coach Bryant's in his golf cart and I go out there and I said, Coach Bryant, I'm Tommy. He said, I know who you are. And I said, I'm just following up with you like you asked about me traveling with the team to Lincoln and to Los Angeles.
Boy, I hope
he said, I think we could do that. Check with Rebecca to get the schedule. Well, Rebecca was Rebecca Christian, his secretary assistant. And so anyway, long story short, I flew with y'all to Lincoln for the Nebraska game. And it was that day that Ole Miss beat Notre Dame in Jackson, because I remember the pilot coming on over the loudspeaker on the plane saying, sorry that y'all lost, but this helps. Ole Miss is just upset Notre Dame in Jackson. Of course, everybody was not in really good mood. It didn't really matter to them at the time. It would turn out to be a huge game. So anyway, we're about to go to Southern Cal, and I'm fired up. I'd never been to Los Angeles. And on Monday of game week, Rebecca calls and said, Tommy, I got bad news. The team charter is full. And man, my heart just sank. But then she said, but Coach Bryant has got you and some of the GAs a ticket on the United Airlines flight out there to go Friday and come back Sunday. So basically he had kept his word. That to me meant the world. And I went out, had a great time, and we ended up, because of the extra day I was out there, we were able to go to Jim Neighbors' home that night for a dinner party and with the Alabama cheerleaders, and it was just and we upset Southern Cal 21-20. They were ranked number one, by the way. But anyway, that was the 77 season. But anything else about those seasons?
It sticks out of my mind, Tommy. But you look at the 78 team. We opened with Nebraska in Birmingham. We went to Columbia, played Missouri. Yeah. We went to Washington and played Washington. We played Southern Cal in Birmingham. You talk about 4 non-conference games. Teams are good nowadays to get one of those type games. The same thing in 77. We played Nebraska, we in Southern Cal, plus the LSU down there in Baton Rouge. And just Coach Bryant he'd play anybody anywhere. And when we flew to Washington in 78 and barely came out of there with a win, but we went to Columbia, played Phil Bradley, quarterback, Kellen Winslow, the tight end. We played Missouri had beaten Notre Dame the week before in 78, if I remember correctly. These were teams, not just big names, good teams. And so Coach Bryant wasn't afraid to play a good non-conference schedule.
Keith, was it a big motive for the 78 team, the way that the 77 season
I think
ended?
it was, because we lost some good players. We lost Johnny Davis and Ozzie Newsome and Bob Kreider and those guys. But we had a good nucleus coming back, and we were that close. I think that we knew we were good enough to compete at that level. And really, we thought we should have had the national championship. So that really did inspire us for the next 2 years.
I remember, I'll just say this as an aside, my sweet grandmother, who was the biggest Crimson Tide fan that I've ever known and the godliest person I've ever known. I have not ever known her to hate anyone, but Air Parsegan was real close. And she just had a particular disdain for Notre Dame. And I remember at the end of the 77 season when the poll came out, indignant doesn't even begin to describe her. I can only imagine what the summer was like in between and what you guys heard from a state full of people that were ready for you to go out and to do something to right the wrong that had happened at the end of the 77 season.
One of the most profound things to me, though, was in 78 after we won the national championship. We came back afterwards and we were all excited. We were number one. We got the position we needed in the polls. And we had a meeting and everybody's fired up. And they said, okay, now it's time to go down to the lower gym and start all over. That was profound because once you reach the mountaintop, you can't stay there. There's no resting on your laurels. You got to go back to the lower gym. You got to start all over. And the Bible says all flesh is like grass and all his glory like the flower of the grass.
Keith, that reminds me, we went out to the 2010 Rose Bowl, or after the 2009 season, to play Texas for the national championship. And of course, we beat Texas that night. And my wife and son and I were staying at the team hotel. And Coach Saban had called a meeting of all the coaches at 7:30 in the morning after we'd beaten Texas the night before. And Bobby Williams came out of that meeting and he looked at me, he said, "Did we win last night?" And Coach Saban got all over them because of all the time they had missed recruiting. That reminded me of that. And Coach Bryant did the same thing. He put it in the past and he was ready for Al Miller or Coach Goostrey or whomever to start running the lower gym for y'all. Keith, as far as your statistics go, your sophomore year, you had 9 catches for 181 yards and 3 TDs. Your junior year, 1978, you had 20 catches for 446 yards and 1 TD. And your senior year, you had 25 catches for 433 yards and 2 TDs. But I heard you say one time, after you played in your first varsity game against Ole Miss in 77, you came out and there was the huge crowds, and there was Coach Bryant, and you were one of the Alabama football players wearing that red and white. But after that game, you realized there was something else in life.
Yeah,
what was that?
That first game really was such a kind of a culmination of all my dreams. Living in South Alabama, growing up an Alabama fan, to wear that red jersey, to play in a game, to catch a pass that night, first night. After the game was over, I realized this was a dream come true. I was right where I wanted to be, what I've been trying to do all my life. And then I realized what our preacher used to say, only two things in this world last forever. That's the word of God and the souls of men. And so I said, God, thank you for letting me play college football, but I want to use whatever platform you give me through football to share the gospel, to make a difference, eternal impact. As I mentioned earlier, all flashes like grass. It's a different champion every year. Somebody else is on top. And so all this life, the successes are fleeting, but having a relationship with the Lord has sustained us through good times and bad. And that's really what I'm so thankful for about sports is the relationships. We've had some good relationships over the years, guys that have come to know the Lord, and we'll spend eternity together. We're in the battle now, but it's a different battle. It's a spiritual battle, and we're doing that. Football was a big part of that, gave me a great platform, and I'm just thankful to have had that opportunity.
One more question before we get into Coach Bryant. Obviously, he went to the Wishbone offense in 71, which is, 90% running plays? What was your role as a receiver? And tell us how the other team knew it was going to be a pass play when the huddle broke.
I jokingly said we didn't throw very often, and you could always tell because I would do a cartwheel coming out of the huddle, and I was so excited to pass. But no, we didn't throw very often. But it was really a great. My sophomore year, you mentioned I had 9 passes. I was the second leading receiver on the team with 9 passes. We didn't throw very often, but it was a great passing offense because it always had one-on-one coverage. And Jeff was a pro quarterback. My junior year, he could throw. Stedman got better and better. And again, because of the way the offense worked, you had one-on-one coverage and had a lot of out routes or coming across the middle post patterns. But it was when I was in high school, I didn't think about those things. I just wanted to play college football, wanted to play in Alabama. Defensive back, punter, center, wherever they would put me. I just wanted to play.
Well, Keith, you mentioned earlier that for your dad, that he was maybe even more of a Coach Bryant fan than he was even an Alabama fan. That's what really stoked your fandom for the Crimson Tide. Now, being somebody that played for Coach Bryant, what made him so special?
Coach Bryant he was a natural leader. He was 6'4", big man, just physically. He was intimidating. He stood out in any crowd. He had that natural leadership ability because he knew people. He knew couldn't treat everybody the same. You got to treat everybody fairly, but he couldn't treat me the same way he would treat some of the other guys because I couldn't handle it. He was really hard on some people. He jumped all over me one day in practice for my shoulder pad had broken, and I ran off the field. And he said, "Pugh, where are you going?" And he embarrassed me in front of the whole team. But he got back. I got in there. My shoulder pad was flapping, and he had just I stayed in there. Finally, a manager came over. But the next morning, my picture's on the front of the sports page having a great scrimmage. Like Keith Pugh did this. You know what I did? I caught 1 pass for 8 yards. He had embarrassed. And who would do that? But he knew that he got on me one time in a game. And the next day on the Coach Bryant show, he apologized because he said Keith was not in as bad a position. But he knew that meant a lot to me because some guys, that's just water off a duck's back. I needed to be mentally tougher, but he knew which buttons to push. We got 2 boys. They're night and day different. The younger one, hard-headed. The older one was more like me. But Coach Bryant knew people. He knew his coaches. He knew how to organize people and get people in the right, surrounded himself with good people. And to me, that's one of the things I've tried to do as a leader is be a people person, help people be successful, and to put them in the areas where they can have success. And then their whole organization will be, the church or organization, whatever you're trying to lead, they will be more successful when people are doing what they're called to do.
Keith, I have heard that we always hear about how Coach Saban was so organized and detailed. And I'm hearing the same thing from you and several others about Coach Bryant. What about his just regular routine practices and all?
Yeah,
Just tell us
that's
about
great
that.
because he never forgot anything. If a team had pulled a gadget play years ago, he's okay. We need to work on this. They're going to try this. And they hadn't done that in 20 years, but they did 20 years ago. So he didn't forget anything, and he always tried. His thing was to expect the unexpected, try to anticipate what this team's going to do. And we always had some little wrinkles. We did something in the Sugar Bowl against Penn State we hadn't done all year. We split our tackles out almost to the sideline and had trips formation on each side. We had worked it on practice. It didn't work in practice, and it didn't work in the game. But he wanted to do something to throw a little wrinkle to have to prepare for it. But he always tried to be prepared for every situation and what is going to happen and what might happen. And I think that's an interesting way to look at life. We got to be thinking all the time and anticipating it. You have a plan for. He would talk to us. You have a plan if you're ahead in the first quarter, if you're behind in the first quarter, what you going to do? And he would talk about football and life. And you're going to lose a job one day. You're going to lose a ball game. How are you going to respond to adversity? Life is not always going to be victories. You got to be ready to suck it up and through tough times.
You talked about the commanding presence that Coach Bryant had just because of his size, his physique. He presented, but he also had a presence about him that was different. What do you remember particular times where you really saw that?
We saw it several times when we would be in Bryant Hall in the cafeteria eating supper, dishes banging, people talking, all this stuff, and the door would open and Coach Bryant walk in, and Rick, at times you could have heard a pin drop. And you're sitting there just praying he doesn't sit at your table. If he goes through the line and he comes around, and we've had Ronald Reagan came to practice and Gerald Ford, people are real prominent, but I never saw anybody with an air about him like Coach. It wasn't haughty air. It was just presence. Some people have that presence when that leaning against the goalpost kind of deal. Wherever he went, that was the response he got. I think a part of that was his physical stature, but just more. I remember just looking at him one day on the bus as he was sitting there, a little kind of slumped over. I thought, I wonder, does he have really close friends? Who does he talk to when he has a problem? Who does he turn to? Sad, but I know he had people like that, but he was one of a kind.
Keith, and my first year in the alumni office was 1982, and I got to travel with Coach a couple of times, and we went to Benny Perrin Day in Decatur. We flew on the plane with him, and it was so intimidating for plane to be 6 or 7 people, and we landed at the Decatur airport, and nobody did anything. Everybody just froze, and he looked around and he said, somebody do something. So we just got up and scrambled around and got off that plane, but because he wanted to be the last one off the plane. That was just his nature. But a couple of years earlier, there was Keith Pugh Day in Evergreen. So tell us about that and Coach Bryant coming to honor you.
First of all, he didn't fly into Evergreen. It was at the Holiday Inn, March 1980. I'll never forget it. The Alumni Association in those days would put on special guys from smaller towns.
Yeah.
And so Coach Bryant was invited. The thing I remember that was most intimidating to me, not just sitting right beside him during the whole night, that was bad enough. But guy comes by, he said, you are going to introduce Coach Bryant, aren't you? And can you imagine that, at any point in life to introduce Coach Bryant, what would you say? I can't remember what I said, but I remember the first thing he said, and this has stuck with me all these years. The first thing he said when he stood up, he said, I love Keith Pugh. He said, I love all my players. And I wish I'd have told him that more often. And then he's talking, but that's powerful. And we talk about his greatness, his intimidation, but you could tell he really was concerned about his play. There were guys, I was working in a camp the summer before our senior year. The girl comes running down the hill and said, Coach Bryant's on the phone. And I said, what? And so anyway, I go up there and he called me because Tommy had said he was not going to come back, and he knew Tommy and I were close. And so I got on the phone, and anyway, it all worked out. But he knew his players. He loved his players. He's concerned about his players. And I think he would have done anything within the parameters of the law for me or any of his players because of that love and devotion. Yeah. But anyway, that night at that banquet, he was there, he spoke, and everybody in Evergreen was thrilled. Certainly I was too.
How did he help you think about your future football?
It's interesting because I'd played in an all-star game, the Japan Bowl. I don't know if they still have it or not, but Jackie Sherrill was one of our coaches. And he said, Keith, why don't you come to Pittsburgh as a graduate assistant? Now, I didn't know what I was going to do. So I made an appointment with Coach Bryant. I went in and said, Coach, what do you think? I've got this opportunity to go to Pittsburgh with Jackie Sherrill. Do you think that's a good idea? We talked about a couple of things. Number one, he talked about the NFL. He said, I think you'll be drafted. But I don't go and spend a couple of years, waste your life. Go ahead and start your career. And I wasn't drafted, but that's another story. We started talking about going to Pittsburgh. He said, if you want to coach, you need to stay here in Alabama, and you'll have the best start here if that's what you want to do. You need to do, if you can do anything else, you don't need to coach. And so this God calls you to preach, don't speak to be a king kind of thing. But he didn't want me to pursue coach. But I helped out some that spring, and then I did coach 1 year at a high school. But anyway, his advice was to go coach, stay here. If you can do anything else, do it.
But you had already decided to go into the ministry of some sort, right? Not necessarily a church or be a pastor, but I know you started out with FCA after that year of coaching, right?
I coached at a high school in Montgomery, a Christian school. I wasn't one of those guys who said I was called to preach when I was 12 years old. As I began to grow in the Lord, I knew that I would invest my life into other men and other people. So I coached for 1 year. I worked with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes for 5 years. Went on staff at a church after that at First Baptist Jackson. We were there 9 years and 11 years as pastor in Sylacauga. But my ministry was discipling men, pouring my life into men. And I did that through youth ministry. I did that as a pastor. And that's what I wanted to do. I felt called to do all my life.
When you were with FCA, you asked Coach Bryant at the Liberty Bowl, his last game, to speak to the FCA breakfast. What was his answer?
So I was a state director for Alabama, and the national organization wanted to honor Coach Bryant at the Liberty Bowl. They have FCA breakfasts at every bowl game. So they called me and said, Keith, can you ask Coach Bryant to come to this breakfast? We want to honor him as he's retiring. And so, again, I made an appointment, and I sat down with Coach Bryant, and I told him why I was there, and said, FCA wants to give you an honor. He said, no, Keith. He said, I couldn't do that. He said, I could never receive any kind of honor as a Christian. He said, I am a Christian now. He said, I want to live a better Christian life, but I haven't been the example that I need to be. Anyway, so I'm not worthy to receive any kind of recognition. And that's because, not me, integrity. He knew that had not been his primary emphasis all those years, but I was encouraged that he did say that he was a Christian now, and he turned me down, and that was into that.
You mentioned Coach Bryant's integrity. What were some of the things that he taught you?
First, just the quality or of hard work and dedication, doing the best you can do every day, every play. He said every team that ever played on Saturday wanted to win, but the team that wins on Saturday is a team that wants to win on Monday. And that involves preparation. And I mentioned too earlier about working with other people, trying to make other people better. But the first thing that I remember he asked me to do was to set goals. He said, when you come to Alabama, you need to have personal goals, team goals. He said, spiritual goals, mentally, physically, and spiritually, the 3 areas of your life. You need to be growing in those areas. So you need to know what you're trying to accomplish. And to do that, you set a goal. So it is in Alabama every year. The goal was to win the national championship.
That's great. What lessons in life did he teach you, and how do you implement these lessons in your everyday life today?
I think it goes back to preparation, just trying to prepare, trying to plan, think about where you want to be 5 years from now. Every year I set personal goals, spiritual goals for my life, physically, working out, spiritually, what I want to do in my quiet time, reading the Bible through, just having a plan for where you want to be. You can't just sit there. He would say every day, today's the most important day of your life. And I'm sitting there thinking, I thought that was yesterday. Every day is the most important day of your life. So you're getting better, you're moving forward. or you're moving backward. So there's just that desire to be better and to continue to improve. And Coach Saban has the same thing about improving and the process. And but Coach Bryant never used those terms, but it's the same principle of getting better. They doing the little thing. But in Alabama, we used to work on recovering fumble. And I thought, gosh, that's so silly. We play Southern Cal, and Rick Neal, at the last play of the game, falls on a fumble onside kick, and we win the game. It's the little things that make a difference. Being on time, telling the truth.
Yeah.
The little things that successful people do. And that's what I want to do, is to do the little things.
Keith, you talked a little bit along the way about the places that the Lord's taking you in your ministry career, but where are you today, and what's the Lord continuing to do?
I was a senior pastor for 32 years. I enjoyed that ministry, and I really felt that's where God had called me about 4 years ago, though I just felt, I heard something years ago. It says, go where you're sent, stay where you're put, give all you've got, and don't quit until you're through. There comes a time when we finish what God has called us to do. And I felt my days as a senior pastor were done. It was time for another chapter. I wasn't ready to retire, wasn't ready to do anything, but just refocus my ministries. I left the pastorate at Alberta Baptist Church. I'm on staff now at First Baptist Church. And Brother Gil McKee is a man I love ministering with, a man of integrity. I came on as associate pastor there, and I'm working with the senior adults at First Baptist Church. And we have a wonderful group of senior adults. I told my wife, we got to have a lot of energy to keep up with this bunch. They go, we have a great time. It's been a wonderful ministry, great opportunities there to continue to minister.
Yeah, Rick, Keith has tried to get me on some of those senior adult trips, but I've told him I'm not a senior adult yet. I saw their itinerary for the Arizona trip. I'm thinking, there's no way I could do all that.
It was,
that was
2 years ago, we
unbelievable.
did 11 national parks in 12 days. It was boom. We're traveling to Ireland here in October. It's been interesting.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to be able to sit down with you, and I pray that the Lord will continue to bless you and your ministry. Thanks for reminiscing with us about your days playing Crimson
It's been
Tide.
my pleasure. God had a purpose in a skinny little guy from Evergreen. Played football there, and the Lord's opened up a lot of opportunities. I probably couldn't have played for any other team in the conference, but Coach Bryant put guys together, made them work together, made us a team. And when you work together in the Wishbone, that everybody had to do their part. And so it was really a team effort. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and very blessed to have been there.
Well, that's amazing. And we want to thank everybody for listening and joining us. We want to remind you that if you're enjoying the Crimson Chronicles podcast, to rate our podcast, comment, let us know what you're enjoying. Let us know what you'd like to hear. We'd love for you to be able to subscribe as well. And that helps us a bunch to be able to know how we're doing and to keep up with you as an audience. We thank you for joining us. For all of us, Keith, the way we end our podcast every time is just with a hearty Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. Thank y'all for having me.